Hello, She Loves community. I am Ida McVicker, and I'm so excited to tell you about my new book that's coming out in April 2022. It's called Recovering Racists, Dismantling White Supremacy and Reclaiming Our Humanity. The book follows my journey of over 30 years and across 3 continents to shatter the lies that white supremacy had embedded deep within my soul. I hope to help white people realize that grappling with this legacy of white supremacy and recovering from our racism is lifelong work, and it requires both inner transformation and societal change. So if you long for healing, change, living into our common humanity, and for a different world, this book is for you. Learn more about the book at idalette.com. That's IDELETTE.com, and get up to 40% off and free shipping at bakerbookhouse.com. I would love to be on this journey with you.
This is Liberating Faith, a She Loves podcast. We are a chorus of voices creating space and weaving together the world we long for, a world that starts with love. This is for people who walk in a faith that remembers God is love. This is for people who want to live out a faith rooted and grounded in love. And as Maya Angelou reminds us, love liberates. Liberating Faith invites you into conversations, stories, and perspectives from around the globe. She Loves has always been about creating both safe and brave spaces on the internet, inviting a chorus of voices to create culture together. We embrace an anti-racist faith, a decolonizing faith, a feminist faith, an affirming faith, because we are liberated together. Here, may you feel rooted and grounded in love. May you be expanded in your listening. May something in you become a little more unbound. May something in you soften. May you find what you are looking for now. This is Liberating Faith. Welcome.
Hey there, everyone. This is Nichole from the She Loves team. I am here today with one of my very best friends, Rachelle Fehr, and we met in a very funny way. I knew of her and her family. We went to the same church, but not really ran in the same circles. I knew her sister-in-law, so when I moved to a small town, her sister-in-law's like, you got to go meet my sister-in-law, Rachelle. She lives there too. I'm like, I'm not knocking on some stranger's door and making her be my friend. Like, that's so weird. And then about a year later, Rachelle and I met because our kids were in the same class and we were on a field trip. And so we were the very tragic parents on a school bus full of recorders, I think is what the trip was. And then from there, it's been, like 8 years of walking through life together. So this is my lovely friend, Rachelle.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here. So I'm Rachelle, and I'm going to give you a little intro about myself. I'm born and raised here on the Canadian prairie. I grew up in Winnipeg, same city as Nick. But even though we kind of, ran in the same church circles, we didn't meet until about 10 years ago when I moved out to this tiny little town in southern Manitoba. So that's where I'm currently living. I have 6 children. I'm a nursing student. I have a granddaughter and another one coming this summer. And that's a little bio about me.
So both Rachelle and I are Indigenous. Mm-hmm. And that's been a big part of our liberation journeys, like individually, and then as friends, to sort of walk each other through this, navigating in our indigeneity and what it means, especially in the context of an evangelical upbringing and church context. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today, about what it means to liberate your faith in the midst of discovering your Indigenous, not discovering, maybe reclaiming your Indigenous identity. Like I said, I'm Métis, and Rachelle is, your mom is she Cree or Ojibwe?
Ojibwe. Yeah. So,
Anishinaabe.
yeah. So mom's Anishinaabe. Yeah. My grandmother was an Anishinaabe woman and my grandfather was Anishinaabe and Icelandic.
Right. So in the midst of this, how about Rachelle, you start with giving a little bit of backstory about why this reclaiming journey has started at this point in your life.
Okay, yeah. So my indigeneity is not something that I grew up with. My mom's Indigenous, like we said, but my dad is an immigrant from Pakistan. And so while I grew up really understanding and knowing my Pakistani culture and history, my mom was part of the 60 Scoop. So she's a 60 Scoop survivor, and she was raised by a white family. So our family history, our culture, our practices, all of that stuff was lost because she didn't grow up with it. So as I've gone on in my life, I became very curious about things. And I know my mom's been curious here and there too, but it became my own process. I wanted to understand and know what happened, who were these people I came from. I think sometimes when you get older, like those questions really start to become more important, right? And so I started digging a few years ago. And I know when my mom first started looking into it 20 some years ago, information was really hard to find. It's slowly, if you're lucky, becoming a little bit more available. And I've been able to dig some things out and learn about who we are and where we came from and how we ended up where we are now.
It's interesting that you're doing this reclaiming, and I think it's tied, or not tied, but maybe connected and fueled your desire to go back to university as a mom of 6.
Yep.
And also you're doing this all in the context of a very conservative community. Where you live, where I had lived, was the Bible Belt.
Yes.
Manitoba. And there's a lot of very conservative, not just expressions of Christianity, but just political ideology also.
Yeah.
And so it makes it really complicated because as Indigenous people, we talk lots about land, and in the area you live in, it's a huge farming community, lots of Eastern European immigrants and generational family farms. Right. And so there's tension that develops there. And you've done some really interesting projects to try and bring a bigger awareness of Indigenous, I hate using the term Indigenous issues because they're not just ours. We live in this Canadian construct that has made life difficult and oppressive and abusive. And so you have teamed up with some local folks to bring their address project to town.
Yep.
And I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Okay. So yeah, there's been a few things that I've started working on the past couple of years. The Red Dress Project has been an absolutely incredible journey because it's nothing that had ever been seen here before. So last year was our first year bringing it to the Pembina Valley, which is where I live. It has been eye-opening for many people. It's caused a lot of conversation. It's also caused a lot of grief, a lot of conversations that have been interesting. I know I keep hearing from people about how they didn't know, they had no idea that, this was such a large issue. And so I'm happy to bring that forward. We've been able to work hand in hand with Jamie Black, the artist behind the Red Dress Project. So we kind of do like a tour of the Pembina Valley, taking our installation to several different towns. For the most part, the art communities or the towns themselves have been very open to having us come and do our installation. There's only been one place in particular that refused to have us there, which honestly, given that the community that we live in, I found quite surprising and encouraging that they were willing to have us there. And some of that I think comes from because a couple years back, I was part of a group of people who were also petitioning, I guess, a local hockey team to change their name. They had a very offensive name for their team, and we were hoping to find something that could be, we were hoping that they would change it. And during that time, the amount of pushback from the community that I received, and not just community members in general, but like the churches, even here, church members, church leaders, was huge. So when I went to the Red Dress Project, I wasn't expecting to have as many people open. I think part of it coincided with the residential school graves were being found at the same time as we were bringing forward our Red Dress Project idea. And so there was more awareness that was happening at that time. I think people were a little bit more open at that time. But it's certainly been interesting bringing Indigenous concerns to the forefront in this community.
I think, I brought this up because I don't know whether you realize, watching you from afar, sometimes, we just want to go down there and rescue you from that pressure cooker. And actually a few weeks ago, I made her come into the city for a weekend and just like exhale. I think we just ordered, we didn't even leave the suite. We ordered takeout and watched movies for a few days just to depressurize, because it is such a struggle. And as you are finding your own liberation, you're liberating other people. And every time I hear what you're doing, I think about the very few other Indigenous families in that town and how you are standing up for them without saying, hey, look at what I'm doing, but you're standing up for their identity and for their kids. And I remember so clearly, because I worked a lot in the schools when we lived there, we had a family move to town and their kids were just blamed for everything. Mm-hmm. And one of the little dudes was a bit of a stinker, but the boys were good. They were respectful people. They were middle schoolers and young teenagers. They were no different than anyone else, but man, the stuff that was said, because they were an Indigenous family that moved to town. Yes. And I think about them, and I think about the journey that you're on to liberate your own story and to find your own footing, but also how you're bringing all of these other people with you, because you're willing to be the face, the brown face in a predominantly white area that says, we're here and this is what's happened to us, and it's important that you know. And I think that there's a sacredness and a holy fire in you that I just want to protect, but I also want to let loose on the world because it's needed. And so, as you're doing this outward work, there's some big inward things that are happening with you also.
Yeah.
And so what are some of the things that have liberated you to step more into this confidence of knowing who you are?
I'm glad you brought that up, because it really is the inward work that has made me able to move forward with some of this outwardly. So I grew up in a very evangelical, conservative, sort of Pentecostal based, and actually Pentecostal in some cases, church. And it was, it had all the things that go along with that. And I know we've talked about that before. So then I moved to what we call the Bible Belt of Southern Manitoba. And some of the things that I felt as a brown person growing up in a very predominantly white Christian church, that I kind of pushed down, or kind of, just taught myself to ignore or not acknowledge, because it's those are people issues, not God issues. Those are, don't go down the slippery slope type of thing.
Great church girls don't do that. They don't.
Exactly.
You don't feel uncomfortable.
You don't make people uncomfortable or question things too hard. Just sing your song and do it. But some of those things that I had taught myself to push down were now all of a sudden in my face, because when you move to a very small town that is overwhelmingly white and conservatively Christian in their culture, in their politics, in their behaviors, and all of that, I couldn't ignore some things anymore, because it was just so in my face. And I'm a mama. And a lot of things were starting to affect my children as well. And that brought out the mama bear. And I just, I think that's where I started to tug at, we talked about how, you know, your faith is like this yarn ball or this nicely knitted sweater. And I started to tug a little bit at some loose strings that I began to see, or that I allowed myself to start to acknowledge that I'd always kind of felt, but I thought, but it no longer became something that I could ignore. And everything just started to unravel from there, Nick. A few years later, I found myself feeling like I was just, there was nothing left. There was this pile of yarn standing at the bottom of my feet. And I was going, what happened? And I think that's because sometimes in the evangelical community, all of our things are so tightly knit together, like you're not allowed to question anything. And because if you start to question one, everything else is coming with it. So yeah, it really started when I moved here. And I don't know what the first issue was that really gave me my moment where I was like, I need to just dive into this. But I do know that the very first thing that really made me question church and my faith and how we do it was diving into the idea of the Bible and how it's put together, and how what I'd been taught to believe about the Bible versus what it really is and how it's supposed to be read. And then when I started to understand that there were some disparities there, it gave me the courage to go ahead and start questioning other things, like the whiteness in church, and the way my family had been ripped apart and not allowed to be who we are in the name of Christianity, and how that happened to so many people, not just here in Canada with Indigenous peoples, but all over the world. The other side of my family is from Pakistan and India, and colonization is a thing there too. And I see it there too. So I think that's where this whole faith liberation story started to find it. When I started to realize that God, there's no ethnicity to God. God isn't a culture or an ethnicity. God is so much bigger than that. Yeah, that liberated my faith and my ability to believe that God is bigger than anything I had ever been taught before.
It was interesting to watch you on this journey because you've been a worship leader at church for all of eternity.
Mm-hmm.
You were a good pastor's wife at one point, and you did all of the things. And we've talked a little bit before about how there's a sense of like you're benign brown in these situations because you're a good, little exotic looking, checking all the white boxes, like it was this weird thing. And then as you began to feel the force of creator in a different way and recognize yourself for the diversity that is within you and the stories that you hold and the beauty and strength in that, you weren't so benign in these church settings anymore.
Yeah.
And it started making the old white dudes a little nervous, and there's some pearl clutching that was happening, and some questions even within your own family about what was happening to you. And like, I think I joke a little bit that perhaps I'm not the favorite friend of yours with some of your family members. Because we're on a parallel path, right? And like, I feel like a little bit of an instigator sometimes with your folks, but I love them, and I honor the journeys that they've each had to walk, and it's not an easy path for them either. And I just think about how like there's a big risk to walking into who you are. Mm-hmm. And you've paid a big price in a lot of ways for that. Yeah. And so even in there though, I see that in the risk and in the price paying, you have claimed more of your liberty and more of your intentional actions within culture as you're understanding it, and in your faith and how those things weave together. So what are some of the more significant like script flipping that you've done from an evangelical context to more of an Indigenous understanding and way of being when it comes to your faith?
When it comes to my faith, okay. A lot of it has been deconstructing the, I kind of get tired of that word, but I'm not sure how else to describe it. Deconstructing the idea of church itself, because I mean, I grew up, we went to church Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesdays and Fridays. And that was just a normal week. That didn't even count for like extra things. And so God and church were inherently interconnected. And there was no separating that. I don't know how many times I was told, you know, you can't forsake the assembling of the brethren, whatever. I love that I just said that in the King James.
The King James is like fused in our bones, like it's there.
I can't get away from it. So yeah, I very much grew up with, you know, the same way you would have. Church and God were almost the same thing. And so as I've journeyed on, and I mean, it's so hard to condense this into 40 minutes, but understanding that God is bigger than the culture that we've created in North American or even evangelical, I would say, because it's not just North American churches, that God is God creator. I find them everywhere. I can worship them beside a river laying tobacco, and that is just as valid an act of worship as singing a Bethel song on Sunday morning. And those realizations are so anti to everything I was raised to think and believe, and so uncomfortable to so many people I know. But understanding that has been the most liberating thing, that God is not confined to those four walls. And there's so many Christian people who would understand that. Of course, God is not just within the walls of the church, but God also isn't just within the church culture that we've created. God isn't just in the traditions and the practices that we've created, because they are really just cultural practices. God is so much bigger than that. And yeah.
It's funny that the evangelical church has positioned themselves as the keepers of the way.
Mm-hmm.
And that what we were raised to believe is like the way of God is actually a relatively new incarnation of the church.
Yeah.
And the church, like I'm also in university at not medical because I'm squeamish. I'm in seminary. And so one of the things that we're talking about is the reinvention of the church and how the gospel was contextualized in places like Asia and Africa before the doctrine of discovery came in. And then that became all things sanctioned through domination. And that is not the way of Jesus. And that trying to peel that away, I think there's a lot of people who have been raised in the evangelical context that feel like without that structure, they don't know Creator. And I'm like, that's okay. Like you get to know, and you get to ask questions, and you get to engage in whatever way is liberating to you. And it doesn't have to be an Indigenous way. That's not the only way either.
Yeah.
It's, I think about Creator in the way that none of us are here by accident. Like our cultures, our languages, our appearances, our diversity, like that's an expression of creativity. And yet so often the church tries to like squash the Creator's creativity to make us all one and the same.
Yes.
And there is like a genuine like liberation to understanding that it's okay. I can be Indigenous and a Christian, or I could be, Ukrainian and a Christian, or I could be South American or Brazilian and a Christian, or I could be Australian. Like I can be whatever my culture is and love Jesus.
Yes.
They are not mutually exclusive. And I see you actually living this out and teaching your littles this, and your bigs just inherently have this goodness in them that is so accepting and so loving. but seeing you do it this intentionally with the littles in a different way is really, really cool. And I love, we just had the spring solstice, and you went out there with the littles and you were talking to them about what this means and taking time to acknowledge the rhythm of our world and creation in such a really beautiful and empowering way. So what are some of the other practices you've been doing with your kids to bring them on your liberation journey?
That's actually been incredible. So there's this part in Manitoba here, up by Riding Mountain, Clear Lake area, that I have always loved. Since the first time I went out there, I've been drawn to the area, not just because it's a beautiful town, but there's something about that area that always drew me back. And then as I uncovered my family history, I've learned that the reserves that my grandparents were from and my great-grandparents is right close to that area. And I believe with all my heart that inside of me, the blood inside of me knew, like my DNA recognized there's something there. And so the first time that I went back to that area after learning my family history, I sat down beside the water and I had laid some tobacco and I was just connecting with Creator, and I cried because there was God and myself and the land were so closely woven together right there in that space. And it was the first time in my life where I felt like this was holy and sacred. This wasn't pagan and scary. And so with my children, I've been trying to foster that love of land and that connection with land, that intentionally, so that I want them to know that that our worship, our people have worshiped through the earth, with the rhythms of that were created by Creator. It just seems to me like when you start to think of it that way, it's so natural and almost obvious that of course we can worship that way. So we follow the cycles and rhythms of the seasons. We celebrated the equinox, we celebrate the winter solstice. I explained to them why these times are important. My husband's family are farmers, so there's a little bit of understanding there as well that, yeah, springtime, we start to think about growth. We start to think about rebirth, and then we can connect it to the ideas of parts of ourselves growing and learning. I mean, they're little, they're 5 and 3 right now. So the concepts are pretty simple at this point, but things like
and
that.
They're 5 and 3, and yet they're 40. Like the wit and those two.
My little old men. And there's a place not too far from here where sage grows wild. And so last summer, I took them there to harvest our sage for the year. And I taught them to lay some tobacco as a thank you, as an offering. And then we prayed, and I've just trying in the everyday pieces of our life, trying to instill in them that these are things that we can do, that our people have done forever and ever, that connect us to God, that connect us to ourselves and with each other.
You've done a really great job of bringing in your husband's family and their traditions also, and taking the boys to the farm and honoring the work that happens there, and the work that their grandparents have put into feeding and caring for the land and whatever too. Like it's very holistic, and it's not just, oh, we're walking this Indigenous path, but you're also including the fullness of their identity and their history too. And I think you're doing a really beautiful job of that. Because that's a hard line to walk too, because that's not their land, and yet it is.
It's been very, very
difficult. Walking a total minefield in this conversation has been something we've talked a lot about, is that, the people who have immigrated, like Manitoba is such a farming province, like it's so huge here.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of farms are owned by like Eastern European immigrants, and they've been here for generations. And so there's a space for them, and their story is woven into the land also.
Yeah.
And it's this and both tension that it's really hard, because when non-Indigenous people hear things like land back, they freak out because they think they're going to be evicted to a country their people haven't been to for hundreds of years also. And it's not always taking back the land. It's an acknowledgement of the shared history and the pre-contact life that was here.
Yes.
And that's a huge part of walking in an activist way or an awareness way in your indigeneity too, is that there are things that have happened and there's nothing that can be done about it. These things have happened, but how we acknowledge these things and how we educate ourselves and others about these things and how we walk forward is super important. And early on in your journey, we were talking and you had the opportunity to meet some elders. And what was said to you is something I think about all the time, even in your work with the Red Dress Project and acknowledging missing and murdered women. And you know where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't you tell the story of what the elder had said to you?
Yeah, so I was talking to an elder in a sharing circle about my journey and where I was in the process that I'd been on, and there's some specific things that were happening at the time that I needed to talk through. And at one point, she told me that I think this is what you're referring to. She told me that there was a couple things that she said, but one of the things she said to me was that I'm going to cry. You were one of our lost ones. Welcome home. And
That still gives me goosebumps when you say that.
That moment has redefined so many things for me. That feeling of connection, that validation of who I am, of my journey, of even though I didn't grow up on a First Nation, I didn't grow up with knowing these things, it is still who I am. That was amazing. Another thing she actually said in that conversation was that as I heal, there will be a ripple effect and the healing will reach out to those around me. And I've started to see some of those things happen in some people that I love so deeply, and seeing those healing moments happen in them because they've found some courage to dig into these things for themselves. All of the hard parts of this journey have suddenly become worth it. It's been worth it for myself and for my kids too, but watching those ripples happen, it's beautiful and it's sacred.
I think that that's something that, when we start talking about liberation, and there's lots of quotes that say about how our liberty and liberations are tied to each other, and it can become like, especially in the She Loves community, because we're so used to this culture that we have established, and we're so used to like the way we communicate with each other. Mm-hmm. But sometimes do I step back and go, it is so true. Like I can sit and I can see your journey unfold and watch these ripples go, and I have the privilege of hearing the tough stuff of the journey, but also in the redemption of your family story.
Yeah.
And it is so sacred, and it blows my mind that all these generations have been disrupted and lost, and in one generation you're turning around and your face towards your people again, and everyone's turning with you.
Yeah.
At different times and in different ways, but there's an acknowledgement, and it's not just in your family, it's in everyone who has the privilege of knowing you and talking to you and seeing the work that you're doing even from afar. And it is very like there's a prophetic element to it. And I think that when that elder was speaking to you, that is the purest form of prophecy I think I've ever heard. And it's the welcome home that sets the stage for that. And I think that it's hard for non-Indigenous people to understand the depth of disconnection that happens because of government instituted interruptions and disruptions of families. Yeah. And so we were talking before we started recording that just recently there was a delegation of Métis First Nation and Inuit folks who headed over to have a little chat with the Pope.
Yeah.
Out of that came an apology. And we were making jokes about why it's such a big deal, because a lot of our spiritual leaders aren't very good at apologizing when things have gone awry. And certainly this isn't a completion of a journey, but I think it's a beginning. The apology that was made is a beginning, and there's lots of debate on whether it's needed and what difference does it make and whatnot. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that also.
Yeah, for sure. So for me, I like what you said about it being a beginning. It's certainly not a conclusion, but it's a beginning. There's this phrase that I've seen hashtagged all over the socials lately, and it says that how does it go again? You need to have recognition before you can have reconciliation, or something like that. And for me, that's what it comes down to. There's been lots of talk about reconciliation for the past couple of years, as people have started to recognize the depth of things that have happened to the Indigenous people in Canada here. There's been reconciliation has been tossed around so much, but until things are acknowledged as truth, until they're no longer swept under the carpet or brushed aside, or even questioned the validity of the stories of things that have happened, until the truth is known, we can't even begin to broach reconciliation. And so I think that's what made that little talk with the Pope so meaningful for so many people, I think, was that finally there was some recognition that it had been ignored or outright denied for so long.
A whole episode just talking about Catholicism and Christianity and Indigenous people. There's so much to sort of unpack and to understand, and how that has impacted generations of people, not just the abuses that have happened, but the spiritual muddling of things. It's hard to even put words to it because there's layers and it's complicated. But I think one of the things that I have seen in this stage of acknowledgement is that I've seen a leader sit and listen, just listen, and not justify anything and not interrupt or try to spin the message, but just listen and begin a process of apology. And I think this Pope is different than past ones, and I think this is the best shot that we've had at a meaningful acknowledgement. It's not a magic cure. The words that have been spoken so far aren't all the words that need to be said, but I just feel like there's a few things that have been modeled that are really important. And I get that for some Indigenous people, this means absolutely nothing.
Oh yeah.
That's totally fine. But for some, it's really important. And I have friends that are part of the delegation, and I can't wait for them to come back and have a chat with them about what this meant to them. Because having someone say that, yes, your experience is true, and I'm sorry that this is what happened, is so powerful and liberating in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you pointed out that he listened. I'm not sure, and I hate saying this, but I'm not sure if I've ever seen, in my own experience, a church leader just listen without making excuses or justifications. That's huge, and I hope people pay attention.
I think what happens all the time in church context is we have this compulsive need to end on hope.
Yeah.
And yes, there is hope in Jesus. And yes, like Jesus is where liberation is. And there is hope for humanity through Christ. And it's also okay to just not say that in the moment and just let the truth sit there for a minute and let the weight of the truth sit there without. I mean, that's my whole thing about we're approaching Easter, and that's my whole thing about an evangelical Easter is we don't sit in Friday. We rush to Sunday.
Yeah.
And we don't sit in the uncertainty of Saturday. Like those folks around the cross had no idea Sunday was coming. They sat all day Saturday with the weight of the truth of what had just happened. And I think that's important. I think sometimes we can't run towards resurrection until we acknowledge that there's been a death.
Yeah.
And hard and hurtful and disappointing. And in this reconciliation process, we need to sit with the death a little bit here. And I think that's been something that, and by we, I don't mean Indigenous people. We've seen it and lived it and felt it and carry it in our bones.
Yeah.
Nationally, there needs to be a sitting in Saturday moment of going, this has happened. And I think some of that has happened since the uncovering of these graves has started. But even in that, so many non-Indigenous people want to hear comforting words from Indigenous leaders about how it'll be okay, and we're moving forward together, and there's reconciliation, and our leaders are so generous and so forgiving that many of them are offering those like immediately. And I think that there needs to be a internal reconciling of, this is what's happened in our nation, and while I may not have actively participated in this, I benefited from these systems. So let's just sit with that for a minute.
Yep.
And
it's
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's that piece of being able to be uncomfortable. That's really hard for a lot of people. It's hard for Christian people. It's hard for non-Christian people. But I find that, and this is my own experience, people who've grown up in very privileged worlds, this tends to be, your white people, who haven't experienced a lifetime of discomfort or learning to push aside their own pain and their own discomfort for the comfort of others. That is hard, but necessary.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that stepping into Indigenous learning spaces and community spaces, it's one of the first things I saw and recognized was that Indigenous folks make a lot of space for listening and sitting with the words that have been spoken. And there's not a lot of and I've noticed even the way I speak and communicate now is different. And this bone of contention with me and my husband is that he'll say something and I'll just sit in silence for a little bit and think about it. And he's like, are you listening? Are you paying attention? Or I'll start saying something and then I'll pause to recalibrate my words. And he'll start talking. I'm like, you're always interrupting me. He goes, you have these massive pauses. I'm like, people,
yeah, I know what you're saying though. The first time I sat in circle, it was very uncomfortable for me. There was so much silence, and I'm not used to that. I was waiting for the pats on the back or the, it's going to be okay. And sometimes it was we just sat. But there's a beauty in that too. There's
I feel like that's the space where healing starts, right? Is nobody is trying to reply to you. They're just letting you be in your moment, and they're sitting with you in it.
Yes.
And that's liberating in and of itself.
It is a sense of community that I had never experienced before, and that I didn't really even know existed. But that, to me, that's what I think of now when I think of community. It's that feeling of sitting with a group of people and they're just there with you, not trying to fix it or poo-poo it, but just being there with you. Yeah.
I love it. And I'm looking at the time and we're running out, but this will obviously not be the last conversation for you and I, but even on the podcast, I think your life experience and your journey are really important. And they have, I'm one of the ripples of your liberation. And I see the things that you do, and I have more courage for my own journey. So as we wrap up, I like to ask a question. What does living the dream look like for you? If you could structure your life in your dream way, what would that look like?
my own personal life. Oh my goodness. So I want my life to, well, I need to finish my degree. I have a lot of goals right now on a personal educational level, finishing my degree, getting my career started on that path. But mostly when I think about my dreams and my future, it's my family. And I think about my children and my grandchildren who are being born. And I think about us living in a holistic way, honoring our indigeneity, honoring our Christianity, bringing all those pieces together in a holistic view. And in my mind, my grandparents are there and they're seeing it and they're a part of it. And we're living the life that they'd only dreamed of. That's my dream. I want to live it for them, for all the people that came before us, for all the hurt and the destruction that happened, to bring the healing and the wholeness back through my family. That's my dream.
That's beautiful. And you're doing it step at a time. So thanks for being with me today, Rachelle. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with you soon.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks.
We hope this episode inspired you to choose radical love. We hope these voices cultivated a curiosity that asks questions. Let us walk towards a new humanity together. We invite you to continue the conversation and join our online community of love, kindness, and accountability at She Loves Mag on Instagram. If you liked this episode, please subscribe and review our podcast on whichever platform you're listening from to help us spread the word about liberating faith. If you have any feedback or questions, please email shelovesmagazine@gmail.com. That's shelovesmagazine@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.